Good afternoon, and welcome to an Ethics Roundtable on the remote learning of ethical decision-making in cybersecurity. I am Tracy Gonzalez-Padron, the director of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative at UCCS College of Business, and a professor of marketing, international business, and strategy. Ethics roundtables like this one provide UCCS faculty and staff, along with invited students and other educators and students from all over Colorado, to join us to hear from an ethics fellow on innovative approaches to teach ethics and implement principle-based ethics in their work or area of expertise. It is my pleasure today to introduce Gedare Bloom, a UCCS Ethics Fellow from the College of Engineering and Applied Science. Gedare is an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science. And now we will have Gedare present.
Thank you, Tracy, for that excellent introduction. So today I'm going to talk, the title of my talk is Remote Learning of Ethical Decision-Making in Cybersecurity. And we're going to start by breaking down what most of those words mean. And hopefully by the end of this, you have a solid understanding. And so right now I want to connect the dots between ethics and cybersecurity and establish the relationship. And I know some of you come from an ethics background, some of you come from a cybersecurity background, and some of you come from a different background altogether. So ethics are the principles you hold that guide your behavior and decisions. And having strong ethics helps you to make good decisions in new situations. That is a sort of high-level definition of ethics. Cybersecurity is a field of practice that protects computer system data, information, and functionality from harm. So how do we connect these two? Well, it comes through that last part about harm. So in ethics, an ethical situation is when a decision's outcome may cause harm to someone or something. So harm is really what connects the dots between ethics and cybersecurity. Now, a specific type of ethical situation that we were going to come back and talk to about later is an ethical dilemma. An ethical dilemma is more or less when no decision is harmless. Oftentimes, this is the situation that presents a decision where you have two moral imperatives that are combating each other, and regardless of what you choose, some harm is going to come. So in cybersecurity, I'm going to define harm as a negative consequence to an asset of a computer system. An asset in a computer system is an information or resource with value to the stakeholders in that system. An attack or cyber attack is the act of causing harm by exploiting a vulnerability. And a vulnerability is an aspect of a system that can cause it to behave incorrectly. So vulnerabilities open up the opportunity for attacks, and attacks can cause harm. So this is the chain of events that can cause a relationship to form between ethics and cybersecurity. So attacks are ethical situations because they can cause harm. Vulnerabilities also cause an ethical situation. So suppose that Penny discovers a vulnerability in a software product that's used in many computer systems. Penny has an obligation not to exploit that vulnerability. This is a legal obligation. She could face legal consequences for exploiting a vulnerability. Penny has a decision to make on whether or not to tell someone else about the vulnerability. Telling someone about a vulnerability is known as disclosing that vulnerability. She could tell the software product vendor, she could tell the world, or she might tell nobody. These are her choices. Inaction is a decision in and of itself. So in the area of disclosure, the ethical situation of telling the software product vendor is known as private disclosure. The vendor might fix it and thereby prevent harm from coming. However, the vendor might do nothing and thereby allow harm to come. Telling the world is known as public or full disclosure. Telling the world publicly can raise awareness of the vulnerability. It may encourage the vendor or others to fix that vulnerability and therefore prevent harm. However, it also makes it easier for adversaries to exploit the vulnerability and therefore can enable or allow harm to happen. Telling nobody is known as non-disclosure. If no one knows about it, no one can exploit it, so it may avoid harm. But if someone already knows about that vulnerability and is exploiting it or finds it independently, this allows harm to come through an action. So vulnerability is an ethical dilemma. No matter which choice you make, harm may still come. So let's take a look at comparing vulnerability disclosure models with the ethical principles of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative. So on the left, I have the 8 ethical principles: integrity, trust, accountability, transparency, fairness, respect, rule of law, and viability, and the sort of short definitions of each of them. So integrity is acting with honesty in all situations. Now, private and public disclosure acts with honesty. It faithfully tells what the vulnerability is to someone. Non-disclosure is not really acting with honesty because you're hiding the vulnerability. So I have labeled this as not integrity. Build trust in all stakeholder relationships. None of these approaches builds trusts across the spectrum of stakeholder relationships. Disclosing a vulnerability only to the private vendor does not build trust in the end users who are affected. Disclosing vulnerabilities to the public without engaging the private vendor is not building trust with the vendor, and non-disclosure is not building trust with anyone. Accountability is about accepting responsibility for all decisions. The private disclosure is shirking the responsibility by punting that to the vendor. Non-disclosure is not taking accountability for the fact that Penny found the vulnerability. Public disclosure does take accountability into consideration. Penny is telling the world about the vulnerability and is accountable for this disclosure. Transparency is about maintaining open and truthful communications. It's not clear if private disclosure is maintaining open and truthful communications because you are restricting the flow of information about the vulnerability only between the security researcher who discovered the vulnerability and the software vendor who's affected. Public disclosure provides sort of a kind of maximal transparency about the vulnerability by publishing openly and widely what happens. Non-disclosure is clearly not transparent. Fairness is about engaging in fair competition and creating equitable and just relationships. Private disclosure is not fair nor equitable to other users who are affected by the vulnerability. If only the software product vendor and the security researcher knows about the vulnerability, then there is not fairness in the communication of the vulnerability information. Public disclosure is fair, although it's not clear that it's just to the software vendor. Non-disclosure is not fair nor just. Respect is about honoring the rights, freedoms, views, and perhaps in this case, most importantly, the property of others. Software is property. So private disclosure honors the property of the software as the vendor's property. And so telling the vendor about the problem with their property is in fact honoring or respecting their property. Public disclosure does not respect the vendor's rights in their property, and it's not clear if non-disclosure is respectful or not. To some extent, you are honoring their rights. The rule of law is about complying with the spirit and intent of laws and regulations. Now, the thing about the rule of law in cybersecurity is that they have a fairly murky relationship. In fact, up until the 1990s, looking for and finding and disclosing vulnerabilities were all illegal activities. So private disclosure seems to follow the rule of law in modern practice by telling a vendor about a vulnerability, although that vulnerability may still be able to pursue legal recourses depending on how that vulnerability was discovered. Public disclosure, it's not clear if it's legal to publicly disclose a vulnerability, and non-disclosure is technically following the rule of law, assuming you haven't broken any laws by finding the vulnerability. Finally, viability, creating long-term value for all relevant stakeholders. Private and public disclosure do create long-term value for stakeholders. They do create short-term problems, but long-term viability of private and public disclosure models do work out. Non-disclosure does not create value in the long term for anyone. So these are the principles of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative and how they stack up with the private, public, and non-disclosure models. So in order to address the gap between sort of the ethics in practice, the idea of a responsible or coordinated disclosure has really been promulgated and put forward as the right way to do security research. So responsible disclosure is a model for cybersecurity researchers, who are also known as ethical hackers, to engage with vendors. So an independent researcher discovers a vulnerability, like Penny. Then Penny should privately disclose that vulnerability to the vendor, along with a timeline, a policy that the researcher follows, where that timeline allows the vendor time to address the security vulnerability. And this is often something between 3 to 6 months, although it's not recommended to have a firm fixed timeline as a policy. If the vulnerability is not fixed in time and the vendor is not engaging with the researcher, then the researcher should publicly disclose the vulnerability in order to, one, put pressure on the vendor to actually go and fix the problem, and two, to make sure that the public and users are aware of the fact that the vulnerability exists. The idea, the core idea behind responsible disclosure, is to hold vendors accountable for security problems. So here's a case study on responsible disclosure and one way that it can go badly. So on the 9th of March, Mallory discovers a bug that reveals shopping cart information for the contents of a shopping cart and the shipping information for a public website, e-commerce website. It does not reveal the billing information. Mallory sends a detailed report to the vendor about the bug and how to exploit it, and gets an acknowledgement back and a case manager assigned as her point of contact. Roughly 1 month later, the case manager reaches out and confirms that they were able to reproduce and confirm the presence of a bug in their system. Approximately 1 month later, in the 4th of May, the vulnerability still exists on the public website, so Mallory asks for an update from the vendor. A different case manager responds to her request and says that he is requesting an update from the product team. The 7th of June, about 1 month more, Mallory requests an update, and the case manager says the bug has been deemed not severe enough to fix urgently and was closed by the product team. So at this point, the bug has not been fixed. It's been approximately 3 months since it was privately disclosed, and the vendor has said that they're not going to fix it. So Mallory publishes a blog post explaining the vulnerability. And a few weeks later, Mallory finds out that cyber criminals are harvesting the vulnerability to collect and sell customer information on the dark web. So what went wrong, and is anyone at fault? Well, we have several problems where the responsible disclosure model broke down. At the start, everything was working out okay. However, when Mallory asked for an update and she got shifted to a different case manager, this shows a lack of transparency between the security researcher and the product vendor. So Mallory, as an independent researcher, does not have any insight into what's going on within the corporate bounds of the software product vendor. And this can cause some confusion as well as a breakdown in, well, trust. And speaking of trust, When Mallory asks for an update and the case manager says the bug is not severe, this indicates a lack of trust both from Mallory's perspective. She doesn't trust the product vendor and that they're doing due diligence. And to some extent, the software product vendor maybe doesn't trust Mallory's analysis of the severity of the bug as exploitable. And then finally, there is a lack of accountability in the end to some extent on both parties' sides, right? Publishing a vulnerability that is exploitable, as well as the software product vendor not taking accountability for fixing their own bugs. So when responsible disclosure is done properly, how does it fare with the ethical principles? Well, responsibility does have integrity. There is honesty and communication between both parties when it's done properly. We'll be honest, it'll be open, and it'll build trust between both the security researcher, product vendors, and the public. There is accountability to be had because the researcher will take accountability for disclosing the vulnerability publicly if the software product vendor does not take accountability to fix it. There is transparency because there is knowledge exchanged between both the vendor and the security researcher about the process. And the security researcher typically will make known the policy that they follow for coordinated disclosure to the vendor. And so there should be transparency in the relationship between the vendor and the security researcher. And there is some transparency between security researchers and the public, subject, of course, to that kind of embargo period during which only the security vendor should know about the vulnerability. Fairness is one of the important aspects, I think, of coordinated disclosure. The security researcher and the product vendor have fairness with respect to each other, and the security researcher offers an opportunity for the vendor to have a say in fixing their own problems. However, the security research also provides fairness to the public to give them an opportunity to be aware of the vulnerability and the problem that exists. Respect also seems to be a key tenet of coordinated disclosure. Security researchers and software product vendors can and should respect each other, as well as respecting the public who makes use of the software and making them aware of the vulnerability in case the software product vendor does not. Rule of law is an interesting one because, again, it's not clear whether or not disclosing vulnerabilities publicly is legal. Finally, viability. Responsible disclosure, when done well, creates long-term value both for security researchers and for product vendors and for the public. Because when it's done well, the security vendors, the product vendors will fix their bugs and release software that's more secure. When it's not done well, the public will be aware of the vulnerabilities that exist and can, to some extent, make their own choices. And there is a sort of economic or market effect that can take place as well when software vendors don't fix their security flawed buggy programs. Okay, so that's an overview of sort of the content of responsible disclosure and the relationship between responsible disclosure and ethics. Now, in terms of my specific project, I'm attempting to build an online program or an online platform for students and others to learn about responsible disclosure and the ethics of cybersecurity. So the design of this platform is based on a cloud-based system using a Moodle learning management or content management system. So Moodle is an open source project. It's sort of analogous to Canvas or Blackboard, but it's free software. And so if you can self-host the Moodle, then you can deliver that content for free to users. It allows students to self-enroll. It allows me to create an administrator account who can set up and take down courses, add and remove instructors and users. So it's a sort of a turnkey, standalone course kind of infrastructure. I've modeled my design after online training software. So if you've ever taken online training, such as a city responsible conduct of research courses, perhaps, or Skillsoft for CU employees, I'm sure you're well aware of Skillsoft. They have this kind of format of lessons that provide content and some primer questions, and then a quiz at the end to test understanding. So that's the model that I'm attempting to follow. So I've created a responsible disclosure course that will have overview and content, such as what I just talked about, case studies like the one I just went over, and quizzes to check understanding of the knowledge of responsible disclosure. And this platform should be extensible in the future to other topics where ethics in hacking or ethics in cybersecurity are relevant. So there's a whole certified ethical hacker curriculum, which costs money because there's a certification associated with it, but we may be able to reproduce some content from certified ethical hacker curriculum without having to pay for the curriculum if no one wants to actually get the certification, or as a way for students to self-study prior to going into the certification process themselves. So that's the design. The implementation right now, I have Moodle installed in a local virtual machine on a server at my house using the Linux Apache MySQL PHP software. So this is called the LAMP stack. This is a fairly common web server implementation, and it should be seamless to transition this off of a local VM into a cloud hosted VM by having it on a local virtual machine. That allows me to develop the course and the content privately and without worrying about any security issues and without having to pay money for cloud resources. To date, I have a basic site created. I made one administrator account, one instructor account, and I have 2 students accounts. It's all local. There's no external access. Eventually, the content I do plan to migrate it to a cloud host. The disclosure course is in progress. I expect to test it with my in my current class, CS 4980, 5980 System Security, which covers penetration testing and disclosure models near the end of the term. So now I'm going to show a short demo of the site in its current progress. Here we have a locally served Moodle. I'll log in first as the instructor. So as an instructor, I can edit my course, and right now I have within the Ethics and Cybersecurity Responsible Disclosure course. There's a disclosure topic, which has a lesson in it. So we can take a look at the lesson on disclosure. And it covers much of the content of disclosure, and it has some progression through the lesson. If we go to the student view, we can log in as a student. So Alice is our student. And Alice is in the Ethics and Cybersecurity course. She can view the different topics. So she can go into the overview of the principles, going back to the introduction to disclosure lesson. So learning what some terminology, and then going into the introduction to disclosure. So the lesson is not complete. I'm going to show the addition of lesson units here as the instructor view. So inside of the introduction to disclosure, we can edit the lesson, and we can see content pages are missing. So we can go to how are vulnerabilities disclosed, and we have additional content. What is full disclosure? So we can edit how are vulnerabilities disclosed and create an additional button inside of the menu here. So what is full disclosure can be a jump, We can add a jump for what is responsible disclosure, and so forth. Save this page. So when we look at the preview page, and a student can navigate to what is full disclosure and what is responsible disclosure. Now these topics aren't yet completed, but this shows you how you can navigate through and have a splitting and then later a merging, and we'll have a quiz at the end. Eventually we'll be able to host this on a cloud platform, and students will be able to register and self-enroll. Here we have, so that is the demo of the platform and an overview of responsible disclosure and the relationship between disclosure and ethics. To learn more about the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative, I encourage you to check out the Daniels Fund website as well as the UCCS Business website. To learn more about disclosure, IamTheCavalry.org is an excellent website that goes into many disclosure topics related to disclosure in lots of different fields, as well as a nice discussion about the importance of disclosure in safety critical systems such as public infrastructure, and how balancing safety with security introduces additional challenges and really, I think, doubles down on the ethical dilemma of disclosure. Google Project Zero is one of the more common disclosure models. And so Project Zero is Google's research security team's sort of umbrella, and they have a disclosure policy that they follow. And well, I guess you can learn more about me from the internet. So thank you. I guess we take questions next.
Yes, please, everyone, ask your questions. You can raise your hand if you know how to do that, or just go ahead and unmute. And for those students who are listening, we actually would really like your comments and questions about how to learn about this issue of disclosure with the ethics. Come on, Gordon, you always have a question. I see you out there.
No, nothing this time. I really liked it though. I liked how you, I'm gonna borrow that idea of just going through the Daniels Fund and having that matrix of where things line up. I thought that really made it clear. It took something abstract and really aligned it so I could really see, you know, where things work and they don't work.
Yeah, thank you. That's inspired by something we do in computer science and software engineering, and it's a sort of a systems engineering trick of sort of color coordinating status tables. So yeah.
So yeah, so I'm from finance, so I like to geek out on things, tables
Absolutely.
and matrices. Thank you, sir.
You know, when you don't have any questions, either you did a good job or a bad job. So.
Oh, I was going to say, I do have a question. If no one else, I still like to hog the show. This Google Project Zero, what exactly is that again?
Yeah, so Google does a lot of security research, and Google does security research on other companies' software because Google interacts with and uses a lot of other software. So Project Zero is an umbrella for the Google security research team, so to speak, and it provides some of the policies that the security researchers follow, including their policy for responsible disclosure, which outlines things like the time that they'll wait for disclosing. So for example, I think they wait 3 months for public disclosure of a vulnerability unless the vulnerability is actively being exploited. If they see active exploits of a vulnerability, they will publicly disclose that vulnerability within 1 day of informing the vendor of the vulnerability.
Oh, so they do that public-private. They let them know, and then they say, "What? We're going to post this out on the blog."
Exactly,
and
and so they have a policy. A policy for that, so that when a company gets engaged by someone who follows that Project Zero policy, the company knows what that policy is. A lot of companies nowadays have a portal for reporting security vulnerabilities. So often security at Microsoft.com, for example, is where they ingest external reports of vulnerabilities, and they have a security team that and case managers, just like the case study that I mentioned, that handle that kind of interaction.
All right, well, I'll relent to give the mic back to Tracy.
Hey, Gedare, this is Gretchen. I have a question. With all this change in the policies and procedures and the visibility and the enforcement and transparency, have you seen an increase in the effectiveness of disclosure in industry, or has it become more convoluted? What's been the pathway and the outcome of a lot of these things being put in place?
Well, it's really hard to measure effectiveness. I would say that certainly from an ethics perspective, and especially thinking about sort of public awareness, I think that the responsible disclosure model has done a really great job of trying to strike that balance. It is more convoluted by the very nature of the fact that it's a three-way relationship between security researchers and vendors and the public, and even between vendors and different vendors, because we do have a very integrated software supply chain. And so security vulnerabilities in one vendor's product affect other vendors. And so I think it's just a complex environment or ecosystem in which these things are happening now, and that is growing more complex. So it's hard to separate, I think, the effect of one from the other, of the complexity of vulnerability disclosures from the complexity of software supply chains, and even nowadays the vulnerability of the software supply chains themselves. That's a whole nother topic.
Absolutely. Do you find that there's a government, this doesn't apply to us. I know I worked in DoD for a long time, and a lot of times that's for them. Do you find that in this realm as well?
That's for them. I
mean-
miss too many
I
pronouns.
mean, sorry, that government folks will say, oh, no, that's for them, right? Then they say it's not necessarily ours as a government
Yes,
entity or
okay.
agency. Sorry.
Right. So there's always silos in punting, right? And anytime there's an institution, and especially for security, which you don't get any financial benefits from security unless you're selling security products. It only costs you money. So they're not, companies are not incentivized to fix their security flaws. And that's why this responsible disclosure model really came about and was necessary, because otherwise companies will ignore vulnerabilities until someone says, well, you're being exploited. So, definitely, like, there's whether an independent security researcher would even tell a company that they're exploitable is something that I think has grown more common because of the model and because of companies' acceptance of this model. Whereas in the past, you could get sued for telling a company that their product was vulnerable, right? So not only that's not my problem, but you are not allowed to tell me that's my problem. Thankfully, that's gotten a lot better over the past maybe 15 years or so.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Abisa. I kind of wanted to piggyback off like the last person that spoke. So I was curious about that in regards to like the responsible disclosure and getting like sued. What are the legal matters there? Because like, although you're trying to do a good thing, depending on how the vendor takes it, like what could someone potentially face if they are like, they're not happy with that?
Yeah, Bisa, that's a great question. So I'm not a lawyer, and I don't even play one on TV, but I do know that there are now some protections for vulnerability disclosure, and so the sort of socio-legal system around cybersecurity has gotten a lot more mature over time. There are still many problems, like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act is still a problem for some people. So DMCA allows companies to essentially, it's actually a criminal law. So the company doesn't sue you. It's not a civil problem, but there's what's the word I'm looking for? Criminal. There's the district attorney essentially can take a claim that someone broke encryption in order to find a vulnerability, and if you circumvent encryption to do something, you can be essentially brought to court over that. There are now, I believe there are exceptions to the DMCA for purposes like security vulnerability discovery. So if your purpose of working around a digital copyright protection is to find vulnerabilities and you disclose them in a certain way, then that gives you some legal protection from that. So the ecosystem has gotten a lot better in that way. Mostly in the last maybe 5 to 10 years, I think, as corporations as well as society has come to understand the benefits of having a more robust and broader participation within the security research and security realm.
Okay, yeah, because I was just wondering because of the example that you gave with Mallory and her publishing like the blog posts, like although she did let them know first.
Yeah, so good corporations and good corporate citizens, they don't go after security researchers because there are other negative effects. So if that company, and if that company is a big company, and that company goes after one independent security researcher, they're going to have other problems, such as other independent security researchers no longer engaging with them, and therefore the security of their software over time will be worse, and they'll suffer some negative publicity as well. So it's a weird, complex system for sure.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm sure it's probably gonna change with time, and I'm curious to see because I could this is just my opinion. I could definitely see it in the future, kind of becoming a thing of like breaking and entering. Essentially, if you're going into someone's website and doing that, I wonder if there's going to be like a legal matter, as in if you were entering someone's building.
Right. So you shouldn't be actively exploiting someone's public facing services without their permission. And that is a general rule for sure.
Thank you.
Yep. I should have that disclaimer whenever I talk about this kind of stuff. Don't go out and hack anyone's system, kids.
Dr. Bloom, I actually have a question. My research is much more focused on the public sector as opposed to private sector. I'm sure you're aware of what happened in Florida recently with the fact that a water filtration system was hacked. What is the difference in standards between the public aspects of disclosure, if disclosure is applied to a public institution as opposed to a private one?
That is an interesting question. I am the cavalry, that iamthecavalry.org website. They actually do have a nice paragraph talking about engagement with safety critical infrastructure and about how that has to be handled a little bit more carefully. That doesn't exactly get to your question, public versus private, but a lot of what we care about in public infrastructure is safety critical, and there's no right answer about whether or not or when you should go public with a vulnerability that you discover in public infrastructure. I do think that public sector is not in some sense as well prepared to accept or ingest those kinds of vulnerability discovery reports. They just don't have the budget, and they have a different kind of sort of brand, if you like, right? Corporate brand versus public brand is a little different. And if it's not going to change how taxpayers pay taxes or how they vote, then it's not clear what the incentives are, right? So there is definitely a difference. I don't know how well studied the difference is between disclosure between private and public sectors. That's an interesting question.
Thank you, Doctor.
I'm looking at it from the other side. The organizations that didn't do transparency or trust in receiving a vulnerability, disclosure. How do we look at that side of the equation?
Yeah, I think that is a little bit of, it's almost like a game in some sense, an iterated game, right? Every time that a security researcher engages with a company, and if it doesn't go well, then that's going to reduce the long-term benefit for that company, I think. And so either the negative outcome of that failure is going to cause the company to adjust, or it's not adjust its behavior, right? So if companies aren't sort of paying the price for those breakdowns, then they have no incentive to change. And that's kind of how I think about it. And so I think that, the public disclosure does introduce that feedback loop of that negative incentive back to a company to improve its processes if that's what caused the breakdown to happen.
To conclude with this session with a special thank you for a very interesting discussion about an issue on cybersecurity that I'm sure everybody is very interested in learning about. And again, the incorporation of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative principles as a way of looking at these issues or cases is very, very welcome. And thank you so very much.
Oh, sure. I had a lot of fun doing it. I'm having a lot of fun doing it.
Great. And we will ask you for an update when you have used this in your classroom.
Absolutely. Fingers crossed it goes well.
Yeah. And so thank you to everyone that participated in this ethics roundtable. If you do have further questions, you can reach out to us and we can make sure that we have these issues addressed. The topic of cybersecurity ethics resides within our focus area on our website of ethics and technology. And so there's a lot of different information about social media and cybersecurity ethics. We have a number of fellows that have looked at this issue. So please reach out to us if you would like more on this topic. And we have a number of events coming up, including in March 30th, a special panel on the social dilemma, which isn't necessarily about cybersecurity ethics, but it's about social media and all of the issues involved in that technology platform. So again, thank you very much. And this concludes our Ethics Roundtable.